Okay, welcome back. It is 5:30. We're going to take a look at the previous lesson again, but we're going to add in the rereading data that we didn't have before. In the first moment, it was the figurative meaning that was emphasized, the parable dimension, which was Lacocque's view. And it spoke of the dead Israel of the Egyptian exile not being able to be resurrected. Their history is closed out, but it gives birth to a new history and a new covenant. And so John 12:24 gets referenced that the seed must die before it can be reborn. There is a transition from death to life. And so the Egyptian Israel has passed away. A remnant will be separated out and raised up from out of Babylon to return to Jerusalem under a new covenant. And that led into Ricoeur's view, which was derived meaning, where vision becomes open to rereadings. And that's the key, is that because what Ricoeur wants to point out, we didn't mention this last time, but what he's trying to point out is that we're ending the era of the major prophets. Ezekiel is going to wrap up things here, and we're going to transition from Ezekiel into the first century and the rereadings of Ezekiel and Isaiah from the point of view of the first century rabbinic teachers and the evolving Christian faith. So we're moving on to rabbinic interpretation, and so Ricoeur wants to prepare us, and so he says the way that we need to be prepared is that the transition took place through Ezekiel when he transitioned from vision to allegorical discourse, and that opened up this possibility. And so Ricoeur concentrated on the announcement that goes beyond vision, beyond the vision through signification and sign models, and the spectacle of the individual bodies being raised up out of the graves caused the break between vision and discourse, and it also caused a break between corporate and individual, because individual people are being raised up out of their graves, individuality is being emphasized, and so it's also pointing to a transition with that regard also, that we're moving from corporate to individual, and we're moving from Egyptian Israel to the remnant that will be raised up out of Babylon. But the spectacle of the open graves causes that break and that transition. So the word of discourse becomes born, and it leans toward the individual and not exclusively the corporate. And so we have the opening tombs, and we have the living dead remnant that will be raised up out of Babylon and return to the New Jerusalem, and they will launch a new history, a new salvation history, a new pathway of the salvation history, and a new covenant, new interpretation of covenant. It's all eschatological, so eschatological discourse is open to revision, of course. Ricoeur says this is all a transition to eschatological discourse. Ezekiel is taken up again and again and again because his eschatological discourse is open to the interruption of new event and the interpretation of new rabbinic interpretation, because it is eschatological and open to revision. So we have the role of new beliefs that is inaugurated through Ezekiel, but it's all opened up through rereading now because it is eschatological discourse. And a major influence was the Hellenistic influence from Athens, which really did concentrate on the individual. And the key rereading is the rereading through the charisma of the evolving Christian faith. The charisma of Christ's resurrection became the pivotal rereading in the first century, the evolving Christian faith. So the inaugurated order of belief by Ezekiel is eschatological and references a new covenant, but that can be interrupted by a new event, and the primary center point new event is the Christ event of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And so we end up with a broadened meaning of Ezekiel 37 through rereadings. And we learned last time that for Ricoeur, that was the imprinting of Ezekiel 37 by Isaiah 53. So we can take a look at a little bit of this rereading now. And I addressed 4 major issues: spiritual sight or spiritual insight, the spectacle, the return, and the doxa glory. If we look at the spiritual insight, Isaiah 53 speaks of the Lord's arm, and in John 12:38, that is all picked up and quoted within the context of Jesus of Nazareth giving sight to those who are spiritually blind and giving blindness to those who are spiritually arrogant and refuse to listen and have no true desire to enter into the kingdom. So there is a rereading based on the ministry of Christ to open the eyes of the spiritually blind. Now, under spectacle in Ezekiel 37:11 through 14, we have those individual bodies being raised up out of their open graves. And we have the Isaiah 53:3 and 4 message of the shepherd and messianic figure, the new David to come, will be a man of sorrows who would take on the sorrows of the elect. And in Matthew 8:17, we have the rereading where healings, Christ's healings, are referred to as bearings, of the bearing up of our sorrows and our affliction, our grave of sorrows and our grave of afflictions. And so healings, according to Matthew, are healings by Christ, because Christ, in an intercessory way, takes up the sorrow and the affliction in order to cause the healing. So it is true intercessory type healing for Matthew. And so he gives us a rereading of Ezekiel 37. Now, Ezekiel also addressed return. In Ezekiel 37:25, there is the vision of the return to Jerusalem. In Isaiah 53, that imprints Ezekiel, speaks of the stray sheep that are turned back by the Lord, by the new David. And in 1 Peter, we've got Simon Peter doing his theology in 1 Peter. In 1 Peter 2:25, we have the return to Jerusalem being equated with the return to Jesus as the shepherd, Jesus as the Messiah shepherd. And that's key, because the new covenant is going to be centered in the new David. The new David, through the rereading, is Jesus of Nazareth for Simon Peter. Now the doxa glory in Ezekiel 37:25 and 27, it speaks of the sanctuary that's to be set up in the midst of the remnant that are called out of Babylon. But in 2 Corinthians 8:16, or 6:16, we have Paul's theological work, and he says that the doxa glory will indwell the individual believer. That will become the sanctuary. You are a temple unto the Lord. The individual believer will be indwelt by the doxa glory, not a temple of stone and mortar. Now, these are all key aspects of New Covenant, but they didn't really come to fruition until the exposition and the parables and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and then later through his apostles and their didache theological work. The theological work of Simon Peter and the theological work of Paul. But they both spoke to the fact that we're no longer going to be in a temple period. We're going to be in an area where the indwelling doxa glory enters the individual believer and will not reside in a holy of holies, but will reside in the individual believer. And that the covenant, the law, will be inscribed and imprinted on the individual believer's heart. So rereadings broaden the Ezekiel vision dramatically, and because of the failure of the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the first century to really understand this new covenant to its full universality, Jesus of Nazareth did very critical teaching, and then his apostles continued that Didache teaching later to emphasize that the transition here is to the indwelling believer. We're dealing with the indwelling believer as the individual who will actually be baptized with and enclose the doxa glory of God's presence, and will have the law of the divine inscribed in tupos, imprinted on their hearts. So in 3, we're talking about the era of the prophets ending. There's a transition to first century rabbinic teaching. It's all about rabbinic teaching in the first century, and also the first century is about the eventual. There's an inaugurating falling away of the temple priesthood, which will become final, but it does begin in the first century. But rabbinic teaching takes the forefront. So everything the prophetic period is consummated. Vision, interpretation, and recognition become a consummated triad. And we get into the realm of Judaic theology and early Christian theology. Underline the word early there because we're talking about the very evolving moments of the Antioch and the Jerusalem church. It's a very early theology concerning Christianity, but it is a third moment of Judaic rabbinic theology coming to the forefront now, and the vision is passed through rereadings, and that leads to what Paul Ricoeur said was the imprinting of Ezekiel 37 with the prophecy of Isaiah 53. So that gives us a little bit additional material. It gives us at least a little bit of a look at the rereadings and the way that the rereadings caused a new imprinting of the Ezekiel prophecy. So it's really it's not a new lesson, but it's a little bit of an expansion on the previous lesson, and that'll wrap us up. From here, we're going to be moving into New Covenant territory.